Now, it was only last month that Michele Bullock, the new RBA governor, initially said the inflation outbreak had been mostly due to international factors and geopolitical shocks like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Middle East. But she has now changed her tune and her message in a major way. Last night, the governor of the Reserve Bank said the inflation problem is increasingly homegrown, warning there are more rate rises on the table.
The remaining inflation challenge we're dealing with is increasingly homegrown and demand-driven. Interest rate rises are squeezing the finances of households with a mortgage. But while the board recognises that there is a wide diversity of experience, the bank's statutory objectives are economy-wide objectives, economy-wide outcomes. And our key tool, the interest rate, is, as we say, it's a blunt one.
Sky News Business Editor Ross Greenwood joins me now. Ross, this is highly problematic for the Prime Minister. He regularly says that inflation and rate rises are because of overseas factors. But Michele Bullock really nipped that in the bud last night.
She did. She belled the cat on what we've been told for pretty much 18 months now by the government. And that is, hey, it's not our fault that there's inflation. It's all coming from overseas. It was quite clearly Russia's invasion on Ukraine that pushed up gas prices. Before then, it was clearly disruptions as a result of COVID that pushed up the price of freight. Now, all of these things added to inflation, there's no doubt. But they were kind of one-offs that ultimately would filter through the economy and would revert back to normal. But the government has persisted with that line, even when it became quite evident that the inflation was becoming homegrown. But the interesting part about Michele Bullock is that she said, well, it's your hairdressers, it's when you go out, it's recreation, it's the dentist, which incurred the wrath of the dentists, I must admit today, who said she should apologise for that, claiming that their fees aren't going through the roof. But everybody recognises that much of this inflation is now out of our control, it's in our community, and it goes back to wage rises, it goes back to the fact that prices have gone up, so businesses have passed on those costs, and that's where inflation comes from. And when you're faced with that as a central banker, as Michele Bullock is now our major central banker, well, your only option, as she says, is to continue to raise interest rates. So that was a very clear warning that though there was an interest rate rise last month, or in the beginning of this month rather than November, that the fact of the matter is there may be more rate rises ahead unless this inflation does disappear and quickly.
Ross, I mean, we all remember the election campaign last year where Anthony Albanese put cost of living at centre stage of the campaign. He blamed Scott Morrison at that point. There was only one rate rise during the election campaign. We've had another 13 or 12 since then. But the point is, now it seems like monetary policy is doing all the heavy lifting. Fiscal policy, and you refer to wages growth there, seems to be at times working in a different direction.
Yes, but you can start to see the panic is coming inside the government as well. And take, for example, the words by the Treasurer only in the past week that we may have to defer some infrastructure projects because that infrastructure spending, in particular by state governments, not only have there been cost blowouts in most of the major projects around Australia, but also on top of that, it's creating more inflation. It's actually taking up more jobs and the cost of materials are increased. I spoke with the boss of Australia's largest brickmaker, Lindsay Partridge, earlier this year. He said he's struggling to get the materials to build the new airport in Sydney because guess what? Others who are also helping to build the new airport in Sydney are also competing for those very same products. So this is something that is economy-wide. This is something that is within the government's control, and the government quite clearly has got to be very careful of its own spending, of the wage rises that come through in the future, of its industrial relations law changes. All of these things are themselves adding to inflation and therefore the pressure on Michele Bullock to continue to raise interest rates.
Yeah, I thought it was good today or last night in that speech that she actually had the courage to talk about homegrown inflation and not feel that she had to stick to this government message of pretending that the reason inflation is looking like it's getting entrenched is purely because of overseas factors. Ross Greenwood, thank you so much for your time, and you can catch Ross every day at 4:30 right before my program.